Retail, a critical discussion of the pathways to better work in the sector. What we're going to do here is we're going to have 2 rounds of questions that are going to start asking the participants to think about the challenges facing retail workers today, and explaining the working conditions and basically what actors can do to change things. It's going to proceed in 2 rounds. We'll have 1 round that'll be about 6 minutes each of questions, and then there's going to be another round that's going to be about 8 minutes each, and then after we're going to open it up for a Q&A with the audience. And even so, because the panelists might even have questions for each other, it's not a strict format in that sense. Why the future of work in retail? I'll just begin by saying, well, first of all, the growth of the service sector has been linked to precarious work. The largest component of the service sector in most countries has been retail. So that's one important reason, is the fact that retail, it's representative of service work in many ways, and it's been hit a lot. Another reason would be the fact that retail is also interesting, particularly in food retail, but some other parts of retail as well. There's been a union presence across the different countries. So you can actually compare what unions are doing across different countries and how this changes outcomes. Another thing that's interesting about retail too is that, there's been a significant evolution within retail and its various industries across countries. So if you think of Canada, for example, if you worked in a supermarket 30 years ago, it was actually a pretty good place to work. It was a middle-class job. Now, if you work in a supermarket, it's not that good of a place to work compared to 30 years ago, especially if you want to support a family, or you want to support more, have a quality of life comparable to what it used to be. In terms of the presenters, we have 4 presenters. We'll have Angelo DiCaro, who, when I got to know Angelo, he was the national rep at Unifor, who was responsible for the retail research side of collective bargaining at retail. And now he about a year ago or half a year ago, he got a great promotion where he's now the research director. But I think that Angelo still thinks a lot about retail because he's still partly responsible for that among many other Unifor's activities at many other sectors and industries. And I know that he's participated in so many events and done so much research and participated in so many rounds of bargaining. Tim, I know a little bit less well, but I know that Tim is obviously with the UFCW, and which is the main union representing retail workers across the country. They have more than Unifor does in terms of membership. And Tim has also been highly active in many events and in representing that union side of things over the years too. So I feel like he's quite an authority on collective bargaining in retail as well. And now in terms of, it might be interesting, I think this is actually an interesting fact, that the 2 academics are not Canadians, because it helps you to provoke further thinking of it. Not only are Peter Ikeler there's both Peter Ikeler and there is Chris Tilley. Peter Ikeler is from sunny old Westbury. He's more of a labor studies prof, and Chris Tilley is at the UCLA. Both of them have done research on retail, not only in the United States, but they've done comparative research as well. And they've both authored books on it. So for example, Chris Tilley has published a book with Françoise Carré called Where Bad Jobs Are Better, Retail Jobs Across Countries and Companies, where he basically looks at the questions that we're looking at in this session. And then Peter wrote a book called Hard Sell, Work and Resistance in Retail Chains. And that's in the United States. And so he's thought very hard about this as well. So basically we have the 4 people that I could think of in my mind that I've encountered over the years that I think have a lot to say on this topic. So I think it's going to be a very rich discussion. And I'll go straight to the first question instead of blabbering on and wasting more of our time with my introductory remarks. And the first question for all of them, and we'll proceed in the order of the panelists on the program, is what are the greatest challenges facing workers today, and which explain the poor working conditions in most of the sector? Now you have 6 minutes for this, and we are going to begin with the first panelist, which is, actually I'm looking for the program. Who's the first one on the program?
I think I was.
Okay, so let's go with you. Perfect, thank you.
Cool, thank you, Sean, and thank you everybody for joining us today in these strange pandemic circumstances. So I'm going to apologize, first off with a few just disclaimers. First, I'm going to focus mainly in my discussion on sort of the US scenario, since that's what I know best, although I will, late in the second question, sort of bridge that into some international comparisons. And the second disclaimer is I am, just to sort of keep myself more or less to time, going to read something. So I'll try to read relatively slowly and clearly, but I do apologize if that's somewhat awkward. Okay, so to the first question, greatest challenges facing retail workers today. I think, to my mind, there's really challenges new and old facing workers in this sector. The new and perhaps biggest challenge across the entire retail sector is the rapid and accelerating shift towards e-commerce. Essentially, this picks up where the de-skilling and customer self-service of the discount model, the big box model, left off. So whereas Walmart, Kmart, Target, and after them the various dollar store chains, again, US focused, drastically de-skilled the work of selling and rationalized in-store design to enable customer self-service, and they were themselves taking their cue from supermarket chains a generation earlier, Amazon et al. Have now completely removed the salesperson. In the general merchandise, or what we may think of as the department store subsector, there was a notable shift away from countertop design and the salesperson as sort of gatekeeper and knowledgeable expert already in the 1950s and 60s. And then, of course, in the 60s, the three major discount chains that I just named appeared actually in the same year, and within a decade had already achieved higher sales volumes than all of the traditional department stores combined. This is again in the US. So we saw the continuing boom of this model through the early 2000s, that is the sort of discount general merchandise, Kmart, Walmart, Target type model, also Costco and a few other examples. Department stores were able to hold on largely by going sort of to an upmarket focus and focusing increasingly on brand name apparel, but not only that, but less toys, less household goods, et cetera, as they had used to focus on. And for many years, there was this sort of dualism between a relatively skilled quasi-craft selling model in the traditional department stores and a sort of de-skilled, glorified stock worker type of model in the discount stores in that branch of general merchandise. The trend here, however, was for product knowledge and substantive customer consultation to be removed from the salesperson, him or herself. Right? Sales workers became increasingly, as many of the workers that I spoke to actually themselves referred to it as glorified stock workers or generalized helpers or cashiers. So this is a trend that was already going on pre-Amazon, pre-Fairway, the whole massive shift that's now accelerating. But with e-commerce, this frontline work, with the exception of perhaps call center agents, who I guess in some capacity are retail workers if they're employed by those employers. Everyone else, however, is non-customer facing, right? It's essentially warehouse stocking and delivery. And to some extent, we might, sociologists are known for trying to coin new multisyllabic terms. We might call this the logistification of retail. Contrary to some apocalyptic scenarios, the retail apocalypse, all that, images that all storefronts are going to sort of disappear overnight. I don't go in for that. That's not this move is not likely the future for all retail workers or firms. But I think it's clear to say that we're witnessing a drastic rebalancing of the sector in some countries more than others, but particularly in the US, away from in-store selling and towards this heavily logistified, computer-aided delivery type model. And of course, the ongoing COVID pandemic, which is the reason we're all seeing each other on Hollywood squares today and not in person, and the attendant need for social distancing is further entrenching and even accelerating this shift to the huge boon of Jeff Bezos and other e-commerce venture leaders and corporate heads, at least in the near term. So briefly, what I want to consider here in this opening question is how these shifts challenge retail workers and contribute to the generally poor working conditions that we see. So I think, first off, we have to acknowledge, and this is not a new fact, that these shifts weaken retail workers' already low marketplace bargaining power. So folks are probably familiar with this term, but just to sort of give the history of it, it was originally coined by Eric Olin Wright, a sociologist, and then popularized by Beverly Silver. And it means the power that groups of workers have due to their possession of scarce skills. So the skills of selling largely come down to interpersonal ability, intuition, what we might call emotional labor, and product knowledge of the specific set of products or range that they're responsible for selling. Some high-end sectors, automobiles, musical instruments, jewelry, custom clothing, et cetera, still require much of both, right? A lot of personal charisma, interactive ability, as well as deeply researched product knowledge. But increasingly, workers in most general merchandise or other middle to low-end sectors of retail are not really required to have much of either, at least in a sort of deep sense. My research into Target and Macy's sales processes revealed repeatedly the discrepancy between salespersons encountered at the first Target to the second Macy's. Target salespersons, with the sole exception of those in electronics, were not really expected to have any formal knowledge of products, and were almost never expected to provide in-depth consultation with customers. And their incentives didn't depend on it, right? They weren't judged or even measured in terms of how many sales they made. They didn't close a sale, right? And that's pretty much the pattern across the discount sector. Thus, Target workers and many more like them, as well as increasing shares of non-customer facing e-commerce workers are de-skilled and more quickly trainable and thus replaceable from an employer perspective. They have less leverage to demand better conditions, individually through threat of separation or collectively through strike or unionization. But on the other hand, I want to briefly consider some positives. There may be some ways in which the general shift towards e-commerce may be increasing the other type of power that workers generally have or can have, and that's structural or disruptive power. This is the counterpart to marketplace power and means strategic positioning within networks of exchange or production. So for example, a small number of warehouse workers in a key nodal distribution center may have limited marketplace power. They may be relatively easily trainable and replaceable from an employer standpoint. But if they stop work or slow down or sick out, this can effectively shut down myriad downstream stores and outlets. So hints of this power have recently been shown in the coronavirus-related walkouts at Amazon, Walmart, Target on May 1st, around that time, and also distribution centers. And however, historically, we have to acknowledge that most retail workers, frontline traditional sales workers, have had very, very little such power, right? Being concentrated as they are at the end of supply chains, at the very sort of last stop of a commodity before it leaves circulation. However, the increasing sort of logistification of retail may incrementally, perhaps more quickly, be changing this and place more retail sector workers, though not necessarily salespeople, in upstream, more strategic nodes. So they may be increasing this other source of power that is counterposed to the sort of craft skilled selling model that we saw in decades past. So of course, we have to add that these objective structural trends are also aided and abetted, these trends that are reducing the power or limiting the power of retail workers to bargain for better wages and conditions, are aided specifically in the US by a very virulent and sophisticated anti-unionism led by leading firms, particularly Walmart, but not only Walmart, Target as well, Amazon as well. All three of these and many others sink millions of dollars every year into very complex union prevention efforts that snuff out or cauterize any and all organizing attempts before they can gain traction or spread. Overall, I'd say that the contemporary retail workers face and this is nothing surprising, a very challenging environment that grants them little power and leverage. I would really sort of narrow it down to sort of 3 or 4 forces: de-skilling, storefront downsizing, logistification, and employer hostility, combined with the historic weakness of retail unions in the US, at least. These forces combined largely contribute to explain the very general low road character of employment in retail. So a lot of challenges, perhaps some pathways for hope, and I'll close my first contribution there.
Great, so let's proceed with Tim now. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I appreciate being here today, and appreciate the ability for me to present on behalf of my union, the United Food and Commercial Workers. I mean, we're fairly keen on this space, as we are an international union with members in both the United States and Canada. We have about 1.2 million members, and the vast bulk of them are in the grocery retail space. We also do a lot of other work in the food industry, particularly with meat processing. So we're pretty integrated all throughout the food supply chain in both Canada and the United States. So one of the things that I would talk about with this in terms of challenges facing retail workers, I think Sean correctly identified in his comments that there's been a tremendous shift in the last 40 to 30 years in terms of what retail looks like, just in terms of perception of employment. So if you go back 40 years, there was some belief that you could have a career in retail, that was a job that had some meaning, that was a good middle-class position. And if you fast forward to today, I think the general perception that a majority of the public have in North America is that retail jobs are extremely devalued, that they are not good jobs, that they are jobs that you give to teenagers or you give to retirees for something to do. And that perception problem causes all kinds of problems all the way around. It certainly causes the workers themselves to feel like the work they do isn't valuable, which generates a bit of a sense of them looking to move to other areas that may have some more perceived value for them or for the public. I mean, it helps the retailers sort of keep that keep that sort of employment down from their perspective. And so we have seen a lot of challenges over that. And when we have tried to address these things, the first hurdle that we come to with the workers themselves and with the public is that there's now this general sense that the jobs don't have much value or much meaning, which is very problematic. I mean, what you're now seeing with this COVID, obviously the most immediate challenge that retail workers have is COVID-19 and the pandemic. They're in harm's way. And if there's sort of something that's encouraging to my union about this, is this idea that that public perception in terms of the value of these workers is starting to shift. Now when we all realize that we all need to eat and that these are the people who are providing the food, I think their value in public perception has started to rise through that. And that is potentially something that we can capitalize on in terms of keeping that perception going to try to change that negative view of what these jobs are and how they do it, not just in the retail space, but also into hospitality, into hotel, into industrial processing as well. You know, a lot of the other challenges that we've been seeing over the 30 years are not new challenges. They have continued to go, and I think Peter certainly touched on a few of them. There has been a sort of general degradation in terms of the kind of work that's being done. The retailers have consistently figured out ways to make the jobs easier to perform, whether it's through technological change or if it's through trying to change employment status from moving people largely from full-time into part-time. One of the locals that I represent directly, Local 633, started out life as a meat cutters local. So if you went into, in Ontario now, a Metro store, the people that are with my union who are in the meat department are in Local 633, and they were designated as skilled trades. They had a trade where they learned to cut meat and do these things. And what we have seen now is that that has shifted completely away, where more and more meat is being pre-cut and is being brought in. And so those workers that used to be considered a skilled trade have gone away. Now we're seeing this push from Amazon and other companies to completely technologically shift the work directly in the workplace, to transition it away from the workers themselves to the customer. They're now trying to convince the customers to become de facto employees of the companies by scanning their own groceries and, picking all this kind of thing. That's going to continue to be a problem. We have not seen that U-Scan devices in Canada anyway have been particularly successful. They do work and they do have them in most retail spaces, but there is generally a bit of a pushback on those things because I think, it's basically running a cash register on the part of the customer, and that's an added frustration for them. Where we may see some additional challenges is where we see the Amazon model of you don't have a cash register at all, you just come in and pick up stuff and walk out. That's where we're going to get into some particular difficulty. And so we're focusing on what does that mean? How do we deal with technological change, not only with the direct workplace itself changing, but then also around sales structure through e-commerce and those models as well. Another area that we certainly look at very strongly, and in the province of Ontario, we see multiple examples of, is employers now shifting away from direct employment to third-party groups, either by moving the work to a third-party company that delivers or brings it in, or in the case of actually doing direct work, having temp agencies provide workers. The Empire Group bought up a grocery retail chain called Farm Boy, and what we're seeing is that they're bringing in third-party contractors to do direct work in the stores too. And so that's something that we are also watching. So there's a whole host of challenges. I mean, we're generally optimistic that the perception angle can be dealt with, and we're continuing to do a lot of work around, how do we protect the jobs? How do we build the future of retail in this country? How do we also grow union density? Because at this point, we're under 40% union density in the Canadian grocery retail space. And if we don't bring everybody up through collective bargaining, then conditions will go the other way, they drop down. And I'll leave it there.
Great, so let's proceed with Angelo DiCaro.
Great, thanks Sean for the invitation. I honestly, I can't think of a better thing I'd rather do on a midday Saturday than talk about retail workers and these challenges. And I mean that honestly, which is kind of pathetic, but it's the truth. And I see some folks who have joined, and I for folks, aside from my role at Unifor, and for folks who don't know, Unifor, we're the largest private sector union in Canada. We've got about 315,000 members, and among those, about 20 to 25,000 in the retail, wholesale, warehousing sectors. So we have a foot in this game, similar to Tim and the UFCW. But some folks I see that have popped in are also folks that I recall from my days at the MIR at U of T. So I want to say hi to those folks. I'm an alumni of that program as well. So as Sean mentioned, I'm the director of research. I still do have responsibilities for research and policy work in the retail sector. And that has brought, in some cases, Tim and I have collaborated on things in the past, which is always very helpful. I don't want to repeat a lot of the things. Those were excellent interventions. I was taking notes, and you covered a lot of really important conceptual things. So I will do my best not to overlap and hopefully offer you something that complements this. I think, as was touched on, this general restructuring that's taken place over the last generation of retail. And when I say retail, I usually default to supermarkets. That's kind of where I go, but I recognize the diversity of the sector. Just a lot of the union workers in retail fall into the supermarket, and some department store workers and pharmacies. So that's kind of where my head goes. And I'm also a former employee, 25 years at Metro stores, once A&P. So I've got my direct experience working in the supermarkets as a steward. But part of that restructuring, and Tim touched on it, is this the degradation of full-time work. This has significantly contributed to the declining standards and wages we've seen in the sector. We are dealing with a dispute right now at Loblaws in Newfoundland. We represent workers at Dominion stores there. I mean, of all the nice things Galen Weston chose to say when he announced he was cutting the pandemic pay, what he failed to mention, despite his love of living wages, is the fact that just 12 months ago, they announced a national restructuring to reduce the number of full-time jobs in the stores. If anybody's seen a seniority list of a supermarket in Canada, and I know Tim can vouch on this, we're looking at, on the good end, mostly about 80% of those workers in the union are part-time. 20% are full-time. In the discount stores, the No Frills, the Food Basics, the Freshcos, it's closer to 90%. In some cases, there is one single full-timer operating a store that's in the bargaining unit. And so Loblaws decided they were going to further reduce and harmonize classifications to bring that 80% up to probably somewhere near 85. We drew a line in the sand, and we're right now in bargaining, trying to fight to keep those jobs. So this is part of the degradation of the work. There are a lot of part-time work. There's always going to be some part-time work, even back in, when it was 60% full-time working in the stores. There's still some value in having this flexibility, but surely to God, having this 80-20 split is tipping the scales far too high. The problem is that not necessarily the work. It's not by virtue of working part of the time. It's that part-time workers have been treated as lesser employees. They've been treated historically as supplementary employees. And maybe that was fine when there was a few of them just coming on the weekends and doing things. They are the bulk of the workforce. And these folks barely make above minimum wage. And that includes in unionized supermarkets, frankly. And we've done some work over the past number of years to try to change that. But it's this mentality, it's entrenched in the sector, that if you work part-time, you should earn lower wages, you should have no entitlement to benefits or very restricted entitlement to benefits, very little entitlement to pensions, and it creates this disparity. So to me, watching this unfold, in addition to the sort of contracting out tendencies in certain functions of these stores, as Tim mentioned, all contributing to a rising precarity in the stores. And I'll add one thing to that, which I've noticed over time, because when we try to organize workers in retail, part of it is organizing people that identify as a worker in the place you're trying to organize. They see some long-term value of fighting for their rights. It's a long haul process. But to do that when you think, well, this is just a temp gig, I'll be here for 6 months, a year. I don't really have an interest in doing this kind of fight when I just need some extra cash. People lose the identity of being a retail worker, a supermarket worker, because it doesn't, the structure of the system doesn't allow for that identity to be built. And so that is a huge problem. The second thing I'll say is around how retailers engage with workers when developing their own operational strategies. And I think that, you know, we talk about new technology, the e-commerce. This is a big thing that's happening. Most retailers we're dealing with, you know, we'll have some conversations with them at the bargaining table, but it's not like from the drawing board kind of conversations. I think that this is a real a gaping hole for workers in terms of trying to build their own sense of security, having these dialogues with employers about how they choose to move forward in addressing these issues. And frankly, I mean, I'll be blunt. I'm not sure a lot of retailers in this country are given high grades for how much foresight they have in their planning for the future. I mean, you look at Sears, it's some of these companies that have just been walloped by e-commerce, which everyone seems to see happening, except some of these big, long retailers. And they're just getting wiped out. Workers are suffering the brunt of that. It's not their investors that are suffering the brunt of that. So finding ways to build places of dialogue help when workers are trying to find a place for themselves in this evolving world. Tim mentioned meat cutters. This is a great example. Over time, you went from a meat cutter that was a skilled trade in a grocery store, bringing in, you know, full carcasses of beef, breaking them down, selling them, understanding how these cuts are. You can come in and get trained within the matter of days to be a meat cutter now at a supermarket because you have no connection to the process itself. And all that's done is devalued our bargaining power. So this happens. There is some dialogue we can do in bargaining, and we have some experiences with that, but it's not happening on the scale, the strategic scale that's needed. And I just worry that this is eventually going to run workers right down. That couples with what Peter talked about on this sort of disinvestment in workers. And I want to talk more about that when we talk about solutions, because he's absolutely right, that there's a disconnection to the work and the knowledge. Now it's all that companies need is a revolving door of people who can operate an X-Acto knife, open a box, put some cereal on a shelf, and stay for 4 hours and go home. I mean, maybe that helps, but I think we're at a tipping point where that is no longer a strategy that can sustain in a super competitive environment. Workers are valuable, and it's how you invest in that value that will maybe determine your success or failure. And right now, there is just a blanket F on all retailers about how they're doing this. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll close off here, is I think what's also contributing to this down swing in working conditions is there has historically been a lack of synchronicity between union workers in the retail sector and the broader retail industry more just in general. And I think we've seen examples, and I don't know if this will shock anybody, but examples where retail workers in unionized shops would bring a sense of resistance to campaigns to increase legislated minimum wages, because there's a view that you know, these things can conflict with collective bargaining. That if I've negotiated a wage over my time of a few dollars an hour, and I'm making $16, the minimum wage is 10. They're going to raise it to 14. Now I feel like I've been slighted by that. That like now I'm not as valuable because I'm closer to making the minimum wage. This has been a complete separation in political activism through bargaining and the political activism on the grassroots level. This is changing, I feel, in the last number of years, and perhaps Tim and I can share some examples of that. But to find ways of better engaging retail workers, politicizing their struggles, to make this a sector-wide sort of initiative, I think also could bring us down the right path. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll pick this up in the next round.
Thank you very much, Angelo. Chris Tilley, please.
Sorry about that. I'm pleased to be in this Zoom room with this group of experts, and I'm happy to see actually a healthy audience Saturday at lunchtime. So thanks for joining us. And I do want to say that this is based on work that I've done jointly with Françoise Carré at the University of Massachusetts Boston, who wasn't able to join us. And yeah, there's perhaps not a lot left to say, but I'm still going to talk for a few minutes here. I guess the way I would frame what everybody's been saying is that There's three interlocking factors going on that sort of make up the big challenge to retail work and retail workers that you could call the Gordian knot of retail. So one is the discounting formula that basically builds in part-time work, low compensation, high turnover, and so on, so that management is devaluing workers in their work. A second that people haven't talked about as much, but Angelo certainly referred to, is that customers are basically really like low prices, and through that and directly are also devaluing retail workers in their work. And that gets played out in demeaning treatment as well. So that, if you talk to retail workers, some of their worst experiences are not with managers, but with customers. The third is that given that this is a minority union environment in both countries, there's a lack of an adequate regulatory floor in terms of compensation, in terms of working conditions, and so on. So there's no backstop, and the kind of constant undermining of the discounting model can sort of proceed full speed ahead. I think the COVID-19 epidemic mainly has sort of spotlighted these things that were already going on, but it spotlighted them by making the consequences even more negative for workers. So on the one, there's two sides of the coin. On the one side, you've got the so-called essential workers, the grocery and pharmacy workers and so on. They're exposed to infection. They're also, at least in the United States, I mean, I don't know if you Canadians are more polite about this, but they've literally been getting verbally and physically attacked up to murder by customers who have been told to, socially distance or put a mask on. So yeah. On the other side, you've got the non-essential retail workers, particularly apparel and department stores, where there's been a lot of stores shut down, either through government mandates or because customers are just afraid to go there. And there, they've just sort of lost jobs and income. So it's both sides of the coin are sort of showing the downgrading of the work. I want to talk about sort of what digital technologies have brought to the party, which other people have mentioned. These new technologies could be improving jobs, but given the track record of retail, it seems most likely, and it's already happening, that they're being used to actually degrade the work further. So the most obvious example, which Peter opened with, is the replacement of store-based work with e-commerce work. I want to actually bracket that and come back to it, but I want to talk about a couple of other things in terms of the jobs that remain in the stores. So one thing is that the new technologies allow for a lot more surveillance of workers. So you've got not just cameras, but cameras backed up by computer vision, which is smart software that can interpret what it's seeing and say, is this worker doing what they're supposed to be doing? The ability to track cell phones, the use of wearable devices of various kinds, task management software where you have to check off everything as you get it done, and so on. There's also a growth in the number of tasks that are quite tightly time constrained. That's been true for decades now for cashiers, but increasingly it's true for stock clerks as well. So when you look at order fulfillment now being done by stock clerks, when you have the micro fulfillment centers in the back of the store, which are sort of these automated mini warehouses, in that situation, the work is machine paced, but even when you're picking directly from the shelves, the pacing is basically the customer expectations in the same way that it was for the cashiers with a long line there. And retailers in this process have often added additional tasks to existing jobs. So having broader jobs could be a good thing, but having speed up more tasks on top of the old ones is obviously not a good thing. So that more cashiers are being shifted to supervising and troubleshooting the self-checkout, but there's never enough staffing to actually sort of deal with the problems as they come up with customers. So it sort of builds in this ongoing friction between customers and cashiers, and the cashier, the supervising cashier, always running to catch up. As an aside, I think that self-checkout rather than Amazon Go type, zero checkout is really the future, because Amazon Go turns out to be an expensive technology that doesn't work very well, at least so far. But that's another conversation. In apparel, salespeople are getting tasked to, during their downtime, be communicating with people online via chat, calling them, FaceTiming them, whatever it may be, to continue selling even when people aren't coming into the store. And then, as I said before, the stock clerks are now doing order fulfillment. And our research assistant hit on a Reddit thread of clerks who are doing the Kroger click list order fulfillment. And they basically say, management never, allows enough time. We are always, either working overtime or just totally, burning ourselves out getting this work done. I'm looking at time, but I'm going to say one word about e-commerce, which is just to emphasize what others have said. This is not actually job elimination, but the replacement of store-based retail by warehouse and delivery retail. If anything, these are jobs that are even more susceptible to surveillance, machine pacing, technological speed up, and so on. So I think that this whole technology dimension is an important thing to keep an eye on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. So now what we're going to do is we're going to proceed in reverse order, so that it's not so that those who presented towards the end have a chance to answer this question first. So we're going to go right back to you, Chris, and ask you, what concrete initiatives should unions, governments, and employers be pursuing to address these challenges and to transform working conditions in the sector? These initiatives may be both pragmatic, addressing the limits of the current legal and economic system, and ideal, meaning transformative solutions. Of the solutions that are being suggested, some of these may not be embraced by current leaders in the labor movement, government, and the private sector. What can be done to change the climate within which poor working conditions in the sector are addressed?
I was looking forward to going last on this one. Actually, I was looking forward to going last on both, but so let me see if I'm sticking my neck too far out, but or not far enough out. So certainly in both countries, a higher minimum wage is part of what we need to do. And in the US, universal health coverage is so overdue in this industry and every other industry. But I wanted to focus on 3 areas. And I will confess that I'm talking from the US, which is mostly a non-union environment. So there's not a lot about unions, but I will get to some towards the end. So the first is regulating scheduling, because the sort of fragmented, unpredictable schedules are one thing that completely drives retail workers nuts. And so at this point in the US, a lot of localities and states are adopting laws to require 2 weeks notice of a schedule, which is a good start, but I think we could do a lot more. Problem is not just that you get notified of your schedule at the last minute, but that schedules are broken up into little pieces, that they're unpredictable, that you work at different times in different weeks and different amounts of time. And I think we could create actual financial disincentives for these practices that would be modeled to some extent on time and a half for overtime, or differential pay for what the Europeans call unsocial hours. You could actually sort of charge a surcharge when there's this kind of crazy fragmentation and uncertainty. There could also be some kinds of regulatory incentives for retailers to allow workers access to the scheduling software to be able to swap shifts and so on. So Susan Lambert has shown at the University of Chicago has shown that the scheduling software today all has this possibility for workers to get on, swap shifts, request things from managers without having to go through a whole rigmarole. But most retailers leave that turned off. So, I mean, just make them turn it on. And I think it's important to note right now that some of the things that are happening with technology are actually creating incentives to go in exactly the wrong direction. So you've got all of this data gathering about, what is the exact perfect amount of staffing to have in each half-hour increment of the day, and in what parts of the store, and even what person should be covering, what moment in what department at each moment of the day, in order to get the maximum increment of sales. So that brings me to area number 2, which is about worker data privacy and the permissible uses of worker data. So at least in the United States, there's a lot of discussion of consumer data privacy, but not a lot on worker data privacy. And to start with, I think there should be some absolute limits put on what data can be gathered from workers. And one obvious one is that if the employer, the retailer, actually this applies to other employers as well, has software on the worker's phone, which they increasingly do, they are just not allowed to watch what's happening outside of work time. I mean, that should just be off the table. And you might think, well, you know, is anybody really trying to do this? Well, in the 2018 teachers strikes in the US, in West Virginia, the teachers were required to wear Fitbits. And if they didn't get in enough steps, their insurance premia were jacked up by the school departments. So yeah, it's happening, it's happening. But then in terms of how the data get used, I'm gonna start with a radical proposal and then back off to something more limited. The radical proposal is, what would happen if we just made the performance data available to the worker and not to management? So that would leave management with the task of motivating workers to use that information to perform better. Management would have to figure out how to do it. So it's not going to happen, but you know, why not imagine something interesting like that? I think that short of a radical proposal like that, the best way to think about this is in fact to have some kind of collective negotiation over what aspects of data are usable for what. I think it's hard to sort of write legislation that deals with a variety of situations. So that brings me to my last area that I want to talk about, which is about worker collective representation. And I would like to see all retail workers have strong unions. You know, union density and the bargaining strength of unions has pretty much been falling in both the US and Canada for decades. And so we could have a discussion of the need for labor law reform to level the playing field. But short of that, I do think, and here I am sticking my neck out a little, I think minority unionism plays an important role. So I'm talking about organizations like Our Walmart, which has now become United for Respect. And I realized that the United Food and Commercial Workers made a decision to cut ties with Our Walmart, and we can talk about that in Q&A if it's interesting. But and it's true that Our Walmart has not been successful in actually increasing union density, but I feel like they've done some pretty important experimentation. The innovation of the minority strikes that have been carried out both in places like Walmart and in the Fight for 15. I mean, it's not the same thing as a majority strike, as Jane McAlevey will repeat over and over again. But I think it's an important way of spreading the word. And there's a whole area of interesting work by now United for Respect of sort of platform-based worker networks. So the WorkIt application, which is used by Walmart workers to do skill building, troubleshooting, but also just network building nationwide across stores, is one example. And they've now, in the current situation, they've been using their online networks to map sort of the spread of COVID in different stores and essentially track that whole process. So I think there's a bunch of things to be learned from them. And, you know, I'd love it if unions and minority unions would be working together closely. But in any case, I think we need all those kinds of actors. I do want to put in a plug for a long-standing idea that Nelson Lichtenstein recently brought up again, which is the idea of worker safety and health councils. So worker-only safety and health councils in all workplaces over a certain size. And you can argue about whether that should be 20 or whether that should be 50. But the idea is to form an embryonic works council. Nelson Lichtenstein, as I said, in terms of responding to workplaces in COVID, said this is a time when it's kind of obvious that workers should have some voice around health. So let's push this issue again. I want to close by sort of asking whether the coronavirus pandemic does offer a good opening new reforms for workers in general and for retail workers in particular. And I initially was more optimistic than I am now. I do think that there was this sort of realization of, oh gosh, we depend on these people, and there was the hero pay and so on. But as the hero pay, the hazard pay has been rolled back, there hasn't been a major outcry. So, you know, and then there's also, again, been this sort of surge of literally attacks on retail workers in the United States that doesn't necessarily suggest that the respect for these workers is universally shared. But at a minimum, the pandemic provides a great opening for this discussion. And so I think it's important to take advantage of that opening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. Let's proceed with Angelo.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I know you're going to cut me off, Sean. I guarantee it. But I got lots of things to share. Just on that last point, though, I mean, it's funny because I would have said the opposite when it came to Canada. We've had, I would say, a good week or so of pretty sustained support publicly for supermarket workers. People are just collectively outraged at this reduction of this premium pay, to the point where it's forced parliamentary members of parliament their hands. On next Monday, they're going to be trotting out CEOs of our supermarket chains and make them sing for their supper in front of Parliament because of this. So we'll see what kind of comes out of that, but this is certainly a big issue in Canada. So I'll try to go quickly. I'll try to stay very practical too about some of these ideas. I've broken it down into three segments: what unions can do, what governments can do, and what employers can do. The first thing I think unions can do, and maybe Tim can talk more about this because I think UFCW has done some good work on this in the past. We talk about high turnover. We talk about high turnover in the retail sector as an impediment to organizing. And it's true in a traditional sense. One thing I've always thought is if we could find ways as unions to invest our time in fighting those ground floor fights that young workers, new workers face. I think what happens in that sector where there is high turnover, you're giving folks who you know are likely going to bounce around a retail sector for a number of years, particularly young workers, until hopefully they find a career job. But we've given them, in that small space that they've had in a unionized environment, a very good experience with unions. They see the utility of unions, and they carry that with them through their careers, and then that could, seed organizing opportunities down the line. And just from a resource perspective, someone who's been on staff somewhere for 3 months has just met their probation. If the question is, are you going to take a grievance that they've filed to arbitration or not? In some cases, we'll say no to that because it's a resource intensive thing. So it's those kind of examples. If we can break that down and use turnover to our advantage by investing in our servicing of members, this could prove effective. I think in addition to that, unions can do a much better job internally, just within themselves, but also across unions in coordinating their bargaining, doing this both in formal and informal ways. That will certainly help because I know that employers very easily like to pick us off against each other. There's a tremendous amount of fragmentation in the supermarket industry, and that only serves to hurt workers. And then I'd say on the third thing is also trying to look at some of these community organizing models. And Unifor has a community chapter model, which is sort of like a minority union model. Don't have bargaining rights necessarily, but it keeps a foothold of political activism within that workplace. And I think this matters not because it's going to rebuild the labor movement necessarily, but it is, as I said earlier, going to help synchronize these struggles between unions and non-union workers to make this struggle collaborative and more effective. And then that benefits everybody in the end. So those three things on the union side. On government side, I think what governments need to do is start looking at ways to facilitate sector-based bargaining strategies. That could mean different things. That could mean, European-based sector models that we bargain at a national level and go forward. But it could also mean tinkering with labor laws to enable fragmented bargaining units to merge, to fit together and compel employers to bargain, not individual bargaining units, but actually as a whole. We have stores in the supermarkets that are single store units. We have other stores that are multi-units. There's 30 stores, and it's just littered across the province of Ontario and elsewhere. That has to change. That is not a sustainable model for building worker power. So governments can do that. Leveraging employment standards. One of the big victories we were about to witness in Ontario was this new equal pay law. That would have got to the heart of my problem with part-time, full-time work ratios, forcing employers to pay these people equally. Tim will agree with me. The way that law manifested, it was not as strong as we needed it to be, but it was the first kicking down the door that we had. There's so much opportunity to balance the scales through labor laws, and the equal pay mechanism is a big one. We have to explore that further. And as Chris said, looking at legislated scheduling protections is also critical. Perhaps a law that requires schedules to be posted 2 weeks in advance of your shift. Like that could be something that is very helpful for the retail sector, and we can go further than that. I think in addition, governments at the very least could reintroduce sector development councils. That's more on the higher level strategic point of view, bringing unions and employers and governments together so we can map out strategies about how to tackle e-commerce, as opposed to just leaving that to the businesses to sort out. There is no platform for this kind of dialogue in Canada, and that's a real problem. On the employer side, and the last thing, and I'll close with this, a few practical things. We've made some strides in the past on this, but I think more effort has to be made about employers being required to have protocols that protect workers from customers. Customers who are violent, customers who are aggressive. You see this occasionally in certain workplaces. I know there's a big sign at the Canadian Tire by my house, a mechanic shop, and I always very glad to see things like that. There is not enough of that in this sector, and that has to change, and that's on employers to do that. As I said earlier, employers can start treating workers as strategic assets, looking at labor not as a simple cost input, but as a strategic value proposition. And that means, going back to what Peter was saying, investing in skills, investing in product knowledge. If I go to the grocery store and I can talk to a meat clerk, and that clerk can tell me how to cook a steak properly, and they'll walk me through how to spice it, that is value that is being lost because all we're doing is shipping them in, open a box, put the package on the shelf, and go home. Like, that is not sustainable. So there's more that they can do there. As I said, more meaningful dialogue about strategic directions that unions can be involved with. E-commerce is on that board. I would say if unions and employers can negotiate what we see in other sectors, and we do have in supermarkets to some degree, is neutrality agreements. Just like, don't pull the Walmart stunt on us. Just lay down your arms. Maybe that's a government mandate that requires them to do that, and enforcing it. Making sure workers have every opportunity to organize and exercise their rights, that would be critical. And last thing, maybe provocatively, maybe private sector employers need to get the heck out of retailing in some cases. Maybe there's such essential cause for retailing. And I think of, in Ontario, our licensed liquor control board. We have government-owned retail stores that sell you essential products that have to be regulated. Maybe that model is a pathway forward. Maybe there's something that we can explore through that sort of ownership structure, or alternative ones, because I think we take the model as it stands now a little bit too much for granted. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it back to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Angelo, and I'm impressed. Right on, 8 minutes on the spot, on the money. Tim, we'll proceed with you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I agree certainly with a lot of what Chris and Angelo had to say. I think Angelo and I have been experiencing a lot of the same kinds of things as we've been working in our respective unions in Canada in the retail space. And so not to reiterate all the points Angelo made, but just to touch back on them, I think what we need to start to do is to reinvest in engaging our own membership to make sure that we understand what the issues they're facing are. And that can be different all across Canada. It can be different inside provinces like Ontario. What we hear from our members in the city of Toronto is different than what we hear from the more rural parts of Ontario in terms of what the priorities are. And that's something that we need to pay attention to and figure out what models work best. I mean, we like our traditions in the labor movement, and it's for good reason, because they work and we're very proud of them. But there are some models that are changing with time and technology and culture, and these are things that we need to take a look at. As Angelo touched on, we recognize in UFCW that we're a very young union. In a lot of people's cases, we're their first union, where they may have had a job in high school at a grocery retail place. And so for the past 20 years, we have definitely tried to invest in just that, to sort of member engagement with younger people, to try to identify what works for them and how do we engage them in their union. How do we make them, even if they are going to move on in 3 years or 4 years or whatever period of time, how do you build a sense from them that they had a value by being a member of the union, that their input was valued? You know, we have to expand that out also into racialized groups to make sure that we are talking. We have a lot of members, particularly in the city of Toronto, who are new Canadians, and we need to make sure that we are addressing these people in ways that are meaningful to them so that they feel valued and then they can contribute in. And what that will do is they'll help us with our collective bargaining as well. If our members are engaged, that will only have a knock-on effect of boosting our bargaining power by making sure that people come out and that they pay attention to these kinds of things. We have a significant challenge in Canada in terms of our legislative, approach. We have seen in the province of Ontario some improvement over the last little while with the previous government. We sort of had a mad rush right at the end of their tenure to try to improve labor laws. I think cynically, I would put that in a way to try to hang on at the last moment. They kind of threw the football down the field, hoping that somebody down there would catch it and they could stay in the game. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. But we saw a significant amount of change in Ontario labor law with a massive boost in our minimum wage, with the addition of paid sick days, with the addition of language for non-unionized people about scheduling and those kinds of things that didn't exist before. And then what we saw is we got a new government elected of so-called progressive conservatives, whose priority number one in terms of coming into office was to strip all of that back out. And so minimum wage was frozen. It got froze at 14 with some indexing that kicks in. The paid sick days were removed. And in fact, the provision for emergency days was made even worse than it had been for 30 years. Somehow that seemed like a good thing to do, which particularly now, given the realities of COVID-19 and where employees were at, definitely seems wrong-headed. So we really need to pick that up because the laws have a big impact on us. We can bargain the best collective agreement, and then if they shift all the laws away, it's just going to strip our ability to go out and unionize other people, or even in some case what we've got into our collective agreements. And that's some of what Angelo was addressing, where we have to look at how do we even go unionize people. The existing model is very tricky in the retail space, not just in grocery retail, but if you look in retail fast food, where every one of these businesses is considered a completely separate business. You know, how do you get a mass density of trying to unionize it, where if you only unionize one McDonald's, say, and the rest in the city don't unionize, then what's going to happen is very quickly, you'll see like what we saw with Walmart, where they'll just come in and shut down the one store they unionized, or they'll find ways to get the workers out of there, and then the whole thing collapses. So we need to find some systems where we can find that sort of more broad mass to really make it successful to get people unionized in the retail space, whether it's food or if it's clothing, if it's grocery retail, etc. And that's all going to happen through a legislative agenda. That I know we're working on very hard. I know Unifor is, as well as our other unions in Canada. And so we need to do that. We're seeing a move to use third parties to do these things. So the Canadian Union of Postal Workers had some success unionizing a group called Foodora, who are the people who delivered food to people. And then what we saw in that particular case is almost as soon as the Ontario Labour Relations Board ruled that they could do that they could be considered employees and unionized, Foodora pulled out of the Ontario marketplace and moved out. But we got to watch that, because it's not just Foodora, it's Amazon, it's temp agency companies, it's all of these things. And we need to find ways to make sure that even the existing framework of laws are not skirted around, because that's been happening fairly consistently over the last decade. And we saw that start in industrial, and then now it's heavily coming into retail and other space. And so we need to do that. And then just finally, getting back to the perception angle, we definitely need to do a better job of raising the profile to people about what the value of these jobs are, and that they do have value, that they're not just throwaway jobs or volunteer jobs or jobs for kids until they get the real job, that these are meaningful things in our society that people use every day and appreciate the value of. And I do think that there's an opening through this COVID-19 to get there because, you know, as grocery stores ended up being some of the only places people could go, I do think a good considerable amount of the public saw that and valued the workers. We have had bad actors in Canada as well. And I also do media handling for my local union, and I have had a number of media hits about people being spat on and gloves being left behind and disgusting behavior on that. But I do think, at least in Canada, that there is some understanding on the part of the public that, hey, you know, these guys are doing some really good work for us, and maybe they deserve some recognition. And we have seen some of that from the media. We've gotten a considerable amount of interest from the media around this angle. We're starting to see that from the politicians, which Angelo was talking about, where our federal politicians have summoned the grocery CEOs in Canada to Ottawa to explain why all at once they decided that nobody needed this emergency pandemic pay anymore, even though the pandemic continues. And so there's some angle there to, you know, look at least right now that people are valuing these jobs, both the public and the politicians, and how can we make sure that that is sustainable in terms of that thought process, that in 6 months that doesn't go away and we're on to the next thing and it's back to business as usual, where a grocery store is just a, you know, a place that people go till they find a better job. And so that's something that we're definitely going to try to take advantage of and put some energy into and raise the profile of these jobs so that the public also supports when we need to do something for the workers in order to improve conditions. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Tim. And then we're going to proceed to Peter now. And after Peter, it'll be Q&A. I could already see that the panelists have struck an accord with the audience. We're getting lots of questions pouring in. So if you can even look at the chat and think about it because there's a wave of them. So Peter.
Cool, thank you everybody. And so I'm gonna really build and add to a lot of the points that Chris, Angelo, and Tim have already laid out. I think I'm in good company here, sort of taking Sean's legitimate question for this go round and maybe reframing it a little bit and saying, in line with a lot of the points that Angelo raised, that, you know, I personally don't see, I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that employers are gonna somehow come to an enlightened perspective and do things on their own to improve retail jobs. They've actually been mainly the cause of most of the problems in recent years and even not so recent years. So that being said, you know, and then with regard to the state, which has various levels and, you know, facets and so on and so forth, you know, I take a more sort of skeptical approach there too, thinking that state actors, either the local or in the US case, state level or the federal level are, you know, they can be pushed to move in a positive pro-worker direction. That has happened in recent years, but they're going to need to be pushed. So what I'm mainly going to focus on is how can they be pushed to enact some of the sort of innovative, helpful policies that Chris has laid out in a more sort of detailed fashion. Like what strategies of mobilization, organization on the worker and union side can make some of those ideas a reality. So I'm going to start with a brief review of some of the points that folks have already raised and history that they've covered, right? What forms of retail worker mobilization have already been tried in the most, maybe not the most, but a very challenging US context. Tim and Angelo have already laid out the sort of huge challenges or severe limitations of the store by store, workplace by workplace. And in the US context, it's the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, official legal model of union organizing, right? Which in most cases fails, right? And especially fails, or even if it does succeed, then ultimately fails through closure or dispersal at large chain outlets, which are usually the main targets and the main actors in the sector. So the formal, in the US, Wagner Act governed pathway to unionization and job improvement is not very viable. I think we're kind of on the same page there. Outside of that framework, folks have already mentioned a lot of the sort of innovative experiments that have been tried with varying degrees of success, right? A lot of it involving what Chris referred to as minority unionism, or what we might also call the worker center model, or taking ideas from, you know, this worker center phenomenon that has grown up in the US since the 90s of non-union organizations that represent workers mainly in a sort of, they don't represent them in a formal capacity, but they serve their needs in a more localized context and help build solidarity and can sort of tap into networks of both knowledge and support in local worker communities. And often, I don't really have the framework here to fully respond to this, but Allison and Ushnish in the chat box raised the legitimate question of racialization of retail and other workers, and how that can be challenged. And worker centers have been they've given us some of the most robust ideas about how demands for racial justice and gender equality can be integrated with worker organizing, and can sort of tap into those identities and make them actionable in a political context. So, okay, we've got our Walmart, which was, a very interesting experiment on the national level in the US, targeting a particular employer. We've had local worker centers. One that I'm particularly familiar with is the Retail Action Project in New York, which preceded our Walmart. And I'm not entirely sure of the back history, but some of its actions may have even seeded the idea for our Walmart on the national level. That was run or seeded by an affiliate of UFCW in the US, the RWDSU, a semi-autonomous, formerly independent, but now affiliated unit within UFCW. And the advantages of these non-union organizations is that they can help attract and build community, points that Angelo was raising, and build identity as retail workers among over a longer time frame than, for example, a given workplace organizing drive, which typically has a time frame maybe a couple months, possibly in extreme circumstances a few years if employers drag their heels in court and so on and so forth, but usually not. These forms of organization can help identify deeper long-term problems, including labor and employment law violations, which can then become key points of leverage for, in Retail Action Project's case, actually leveraging real unionization, as well as winning back wage settlements for workers and improving conditions. And that's mainly based on sort of a series of New York City mobilizations and drives that particular organization was successful in, and that I and some colleagues have documented elsewhere. But our Walmart, in the series of Black Friday and other protests and walkouts that happened, minority strikes, demonstrations that got a lot of publicity, combined with the nationwide Fight for 15 campaign spearheaded by SEIU, helped push multiple states and localities to raise minimum wages, as Chris pointed out, and in several cases to pass fair scheduling and sick pay statutes that have directly impacted retailers. Right? So through pushing against the state effectively, at least the local state, they have actually found ways to compel employers to treat workers better and to improve conditions. But still, overall, the sort of worker center collaboration or minority union model experiment that has been deployed in the US recently has yielded very little, if any, formal unionization and sort of durable, lasting organization for retail workers. And I think because of this, this still explains why wages and conditions are still below tolerable levels in the aggregate. And perhaps I'll leave Tim to sort of explain this, or he doesn't have to, but if Tim wants to respond to this, I think the lack of payoff and sort of dues paying members for UFCW may have contributed to why some of the funding was withdrawn from the Our Walmart project a few years back. Okay, so if we've got these two models, the formal dead-end NLRB model in the US and the sort of more promising but still not fully successful sort of worker center collaboration outside NLRB model, what else can be done? So here's where I really want to make great use and reference to Chris's work with Francoise in their book, Where Bad Jobs Are Better, and sort of give us a bit of an international view, which I guess we're already inherently getting here because we are a sort of multinational panel. I think Chris and Francois' books takes us a long way towards understanding the dynamics that make retail generally bad and what approaches might make it better. The countries in their sample where they actually do find retail jobs to be not so bad and to be better are notably France and Germany, two Western European countries with historically strong labor movements, labor or socialist parties that advocated militantly at the political level and the federal level, national level, and established corporatist collective bargaining structures. In France, they find that strong minimum wage laws have played a determining role in improving paying conditions. And in Germany, specifically the sort of vocational training framework of how people get into jobs post-secondary education, which is much broader than just retail, but of course goes into the retail sector itself. I lived in Germany myself for 2.5 years and did a degree there, so I'm somewhat familiar with at least that process as it unfolds in daily life there, which is very different to the U.S. model. It's a whole other pathway into employment besides the sort of tertiary education model, which is becoming more predominant in the U.S. And I think deserves some greater attention. And unlike in the US and Canada, where union membership and coverage are largely overlapping, the corporatist regional contracts in France and Germany yield much higher coverage and protection rates for workers than the formal membership suggests. I think France is overall, what, 8% union membership, but something like 90% coverage. Germany's a little bit less extreme. It's like 20 or 19 and 65. But we can see this yawning gap, this much bigger gap between, which is actually to the benefit of workers, that even if they're not members of unions, they actually get the benefits of a negotiated contract. And I think Chris and Francois' works also show that even Walmart, what we've sort of identified here as one of the arch nemeses of retail unionism, has been forced to work with unions in Canada, occasionally, in Argentina, in Brazil, and Carolina Bank Munoz, in her recent book, Building Power from Below, also shows how unions have forced Walmart to the table or improved conditions in Chile. And the upshot, I think, of these important sort of international case studies and lessons is that bad retail jobs are not inevitable, right? Are not sort of wholly predetermined by structural or industrial dynamics. Their badness generally is largely politically and organizationally determined. In the US, I think it's a little bit difficult to find immediate applicability for these international lessons, at least that will sort of in the near term gain traction. But I think there are three that I'm going to briefly attempt to outline here, two that are more pragmatic and one that's more transformational, to use Sean's term. The first is essentially focusing on and refining the approach that's sort of embodied in the worker-centered collaboration model. I've referred to this elsewhere as community-based industrial unionism, but whatever. I mean, it's a model that's already out there and has been cautiously tested and has a lot in common with the famous example of Justice for Janitors in the early 90s in Los Angeles. Retail worker unions or would-be unions focusing their attention and resources on building a durable, solidaristic organization within a metropolitan region that's also focused on a specific industry. And that can help leverage whatever marketplace power does exist, as well as building identity and links, networks of solidarity and cooperation among groups of workers, but in a sort of place-bound nature. And with retail, one advantage is that the stores and the outlets are they're relatively place-bound, right? They're a small amount of sunk capital totally, but they're not. You can't outsource storefront retailing to a far country, right?
And Peter, if we could wrap it up maybe in about 15 seconds, 20 seconds.
15 seconds, gotcha. All right.
Thank you.
So second, more pragmatic thing that I'm going to lay out, which is nothing new that I'm inventing here, is just sort of supply chain leveraging, going up the chain and sort of focusing, as many work organizations and unions are already doing, on the structural power of logistics workers. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with this, the more transformational proposal, which I was pleased to see Angelo and I think to a certain extent Tim actually referencing, is the idea of moving towards a model of union negotiation and contract setting that's something like the French and German model, right? A sort of corporatist, regionally negotiated model. And I'll throw it in the chat. There's an interesting, some might call it pie in the sky, sort of legalistic piece that came out in the Yale Law Journal recently by Kate Andreas, that essentially says this is the way to go, at least for US labor mobilization and legal thinking, right? Is towards a model like that. And she thinks that it's actually prefigured in the Fight for 15 and in some of the mobilization around our Walmart. So I will stop it there. I'll throw that in the chat. And again, I want to thank everybody for the great discussion so far. I look forward to the questions.
Okay, so we have actually a barrage of questions now. I'd be shocked if we can get them all answered by 1:30. So I would ask, I don't know about the panelists and the people. I would ask, we'll try our best to get as much answered as possible. We can go longer if that is okay with everybody. Maybe adding on maybe 15 minutes. Is that okay with the panelists at least? Do you guys have 15 minutes, or are you off to race for a lunch with the family or something? I get nods. I don't know about Angelo. Okay, Angelo's got a. So we'll Angelo, I'll go first to you with the answers. Then you'll have the first turn. So get ready to write down these questions, and then I'll also be asked. A few people want to ask them live. So first we've got Ushnish Sengupta, who says, job losses in retail have disproportionately impacted racialized workers. How do we ensure the reopening of the retail economy and rehiring processes, and that rehiring processes do not further disadvantage racialized workers? Then adding to that question, Alison Starkey says, I would like to add gender racialized workers. Going further on, we have another question. Johanna asked, if it has not been addressed, I would be interested in how each of these unions are following the work of the brick and mortar stores to the new delivery space, i.e., trying to bring that back in-house rather than as a subcontracting or platform ruled base, or how to represent those workers due to their important interface, and so on. Then we have, let me go back down. Peggy Nash asks, what do the panelists think about Quebec's decree system, where with government having, wants to find a solution to an extended agreement with one employer to all employers in the sector? So we're talking about, there's been discussion of sectoral bargaining. The decree system is like sectoral bargaining, but it's not at all the same thing. So I don't know how familiar you are with that, but if you can speak to that. Not at all. Okay, well, if you can't.
Nope.
Oh, you can. Okay, great. Then we have another one by Marley Weiss that says, should Canadian provinces adopt something like California AB5? This is the ABC employment relationship definition. I asked her to give a definition of this later, which looks like it is spreading to other US states. I believe in Canada, there are laws at provincial levels that create a middle category of independent worker, which is a very different approach. And then she says, an ABC law disrupts retailers who seek to place a labor supply intermediary between themselves and the workers, or to turn the workers into independent contractors. John Peters has quite a lot to say. I'm just going to let him ask himself in a second. Ushnis Sengupta asked another question about saying many retailers are consumer cooperatives as opposed to worker cooperatives. Does the form of organization, i.e. a consumer cooperative, improve worker wages, benefits, or conditions? Then Marley Weiss brings up something. I don't know if that's a question. If it is, she can message me directly. Dion, I'll give you a second to speak, as well as John. Matthew Fisher Daly wrote a question in here on Peter's point regarding what are your thoughts regarding cross-commodity chain efforts such as the food chain workers for increasing leverage? So that'll be in relation to John's question. Okay, this is somebody else. Just one point, there's an AGM meeting at 2 p.m. just so that people know if they want to go for the attendees. And okay, so then we have 3 people that want to say something live. Let's start with John, then we'll go to Dion, and then let's go to Allison Starkey. If you guys can make it really quick because we're running in time, like turn it on, quick questions, turn it off. John first.
Already a half dozen questions, so I'm guessing we're not going to get all answers today. Great discussion, really great insights, much appreciated. I know we're not going to get to the question, but you've spoken about the problems of labor law reform. You've spoken about the problems of massive multinational corporations, and you've spoken about all the problems of all those workers who are in those sectors and how unions, UFCW, Unifor, all the sort of food, other sort of small commercial and retail unions are all facing huge problems. It looks like you're facing a mountain and you're going to go climb that mountain and you got a pickaxe. And at the same time, there's someone up at the top there's throwing boulders at you. Jane McAlevy's has argued the only way we're going to get back to any kind of balance for workers in Canada and the United States is to take strikes. You haven't spoken about strikes. And if you're going to organize in supply chains, you're going to organize in stores, you're going to organize in New York, what about unions coming together? What about UFCW and Unifor and other SEIU unions coming together and making a national strategy again? Go back to the 1930s, go back to the 1940s. Target major industries, target major cities, take strikes illegal and illegal, use that as a leverage, try to win some major gains, get those workers involved, suddenly make a movement where you can make all those kinds of demands that you're talking about. That's Jane's solution. I'm wondering what you have to think about that and what's your opinion of that.
Okay, Dion, and by the way, I know that you guys can't answer all of these questions. There's a barrage of them. There'll be some strategic answering, of course. Dion, quick question, and then Allison, quick question, on and off.
So thank you all so much. This was an excellent panel. To Chris's point about in the pandemic, there being sort of this divergence between essential and non-essential workers, I'm just a little bit surprised that nobody's talked about any outside of the labor market policies like basic income. So for instance, in Canada, the response with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit was really inadequate because it only was given to workers who were involuntarily unemployed. So workers couldn't make a choice about whether or not to go to work or not. And so I'm just wondering, particularly for Angelo and Tim, like what are your union's thoughts or positions on basic income? And for the Chris and Peter, is that part of the policy toolkit in sort of dealing with some of the problems beyond just like increases to the minimum wage, which in Canada are known to have slightly worse impacts than in the United States? Thanks.
Okay, Allison, very quickly.
Thinking about the rating system that you often have with retail grocery workers, recently I had to get groceries delivered contact-free because I had to isolate at home. And the worker that I was dealing with, at the end of it, I had to give him a rating. And my rating was tempered by my own experience as a retail worker in pharmacy, and knowing all of the structural constrictions that he was probably dealing with. But I'm just thinking in terms of like Merchant Donnie's work on transnational call workers experiencing racism through this contact-free, voice-free environment, and how ratings affects the worker, and what unions are doing to sort of mitigate those effects, because it's not just psychosocial, it's also they're being appraised by their employer and praised by the customer, which impacts their employability and maintaining their job. But also I was thinking like, okay, who's paying for this guy's phone? Is it his own phone? And if he doesn't have a good phone to do this with, does that mean that he doesn't have a job? And thinking in terms of surveillance, if he's using his own phone, in this process, is his employer is surveilling him? And all of these questions regarding the rating system, and there are more, but we don't really have time to go there right now. So if somebody could just maybe talk a little bit about that, if there's any movement on the ratings, the way employees are experiencing rating systems.
Thank you for that. So we'll start with Angelo. Angelo, we'll give you 5 minutes each. So Angelo will finish at 30, and we'll start off with the practitioners and go to the academics. Angelo, and then it'll be Tim.
Okay, thanks. And sorry, the 1:30. My kids are waiting to grab me, so I have to bolt. So I apologize for that, but I'd love to stay all day if we could. I'll be very quick. On the question of racialized workers and the intersectionality with gender on that, I think is a brilliant question. And I addressed it in the chat line a little bit. I have to think a little bit more about the procedures in place about rehiring and how that's going to work, because I think in a lot of the essential workplaces, there's not a huge question of rehiring, and that's the ones we've been dealing with most closely. And so I don't know that that's a direct issue. However, issues are rife for racialized workers in the retail sector, specifically in urban communities. And that's where some of the suggestions that I had posed around equal pay would do wonders. A lot of women in supermarkets, especially, they tend to work in the front-facing parts of the stores, and they're mostly part-time. And then the men tend to work in the back rooms, and they're, the former high-skilled folks. And that's just a loose description, but that's the separation. And so these equal pay measures will definitely disproportionately benefit women and workers of color, no doubt. So more to say on that, but I'll leave that there. On the bricks and mortar issue and how we're kind of chasing this along, I think every employer is doing things differently. We had some good progress with Metro supermarkets in our last round of bargaining. Metro's taken the approach that they're going to use in-house unionized workers to do their pick and pay system and their picking and fielding e-commerce purchases. And so that's good. I know Loblaws took a different approach in different parts of the country. So where we can through bargaining, we're trying to leverage our power to strike language and negotiate those terms. So that's happening. But again, when you look at the sector on its scale, it's just unbelievable. And I don't know what degree in which unions with like 12% density in the sector are going to make a dent in terms of what these plans are. That goes back to my point about sector-based and tripartite council strategies to influence. On the decree system in Quebec, yes, Peggy knows very well about this, and so folks are aware. This system has been very useful for Unifor and CAW prior. stitching together independent auto dealerships. Talk about another significant part of the retail sector, the auto dealerships, and pooling together dozens and dozens of these individual, franchise-owned dealerships into a common collective bargaining process, which now gives us 4,000 members bargaining at one time, tremendous leverage. This is exactly the kind of model. Doesn't have to look exactly the same, but the same idea of trying to pull franchise stores together under a common umbrella, pooling discount and conventional stores together under an umbrella. We need these sorts of legal tools in order to make gains. So I would be supportive of that. I'm not an expert on the Californian AB5 rules. I know a bit about it. I still question, trying to find these middle ground approaches when companies like Uber, I think that's their end game. They come in with a huge demand of saying, don't regulate us. And we're saying, yes, we have to. And they'll say, well, okay, we'll take the middle path. You can treat us differently. And I think that still doesn't get at the problem of this exceptional treatment. So I question the AB5 models still opening for contracting out and what, that status actually means. I think employers can play with that. So I have to see how this works in practice to have a better assessment of it. In terms of strikes, sign me up. I'm good. We're ready to go. But I guess there's a sequence of things that have to happen. Right now, if we were to go to our members and say, let's strike, they'd say, no, thanks. And we'd be like, okay, we have to prep this. We have to build on this. And we're trying to do that. It's a very challenging thing. But I think, as John was saying, this is the tool we need down the line to exercise, because that's how we're going to make the kind of change that we need. On basic income, I'll tell you, depending on what we're talking about, I'm a fan, not a fan. I guess without going into another day-long session on this, I think where Unifor stands is supporting the idea of a floor of supports for workers at all times. But what that doesn't mean, and we don't support, is bringing in a system that basically lets employers off the hook to pay wages because the public is subsidizing them. And that's not on for me personally. I don't think that's the right approach. There's got to be equal treatment on how we do this, but certainly the concept of a floor of benefits is critical, and we have to look at that. And on the rating system, I wish I had more to say. We don't represent workers who do the delivery of these goods. Maybe one day we will. We are fighting to do that. So in terms of how this plays out, I'd only give you an answer as a consumer and someone who's kind of observing this from the outside. So I'd rather not go down that path. And maybe Tim has better experiences on that. So I think that was all the questions, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for participating, Angelo. I'll say, sacrificing time on a Saturday, I think you brought a lot to the discussion. This was absolutely great. And I'm saying this now because you might disappear in the next couple minutes, and I'll thank everybody else afterwards. Let's go straight on to Tim.
Thanks, Sean. And Angelo, if you go, nice seeing you again, and I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. So to run down some of the same questions that Angelo addressed, I mean, racialized workers, as I said, this is something that I think as unions, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to. We have a significant amount of new Canadians, as we call them, that come in from very many different countries, particularly in the Ontario context into Toronto and our other large urban centers. And what we need to do is make sure that these people have a sense that their union is there to represent them. And that means that the people they talk to, they can actually talk to, that they speak their languages, that they understand the cultures, that they are representative of the communities that they're a part of. And so in UFCW, we've done a significant amount of work to make sure that our representation is diverse and actually represents the members. Long way to go on that. We're certainly not perfect, but we've invested a lot of work in that to make sure that when people come to talk to us, they can actually do that and they feel that they see themselves in the union that they're there for. Like Angelo said, a large part of our retail workspace has been working all the way through this. And so we have, for our members too, we have collective bargaining language that talks about rehiring. They have seniority and there's layoff and that. So largely that would be run through the collective agreement. But we need to make sure that people know that they have a collective agreement and that they can read the collective agreement and that they know who they can talk to. And so that's some of where that work comes in. Talking about bringing back in services that have contracted out, like Angelo was addressing, we've been partially able to do that through our collective bargaining, both with Metro and Loblaws, where we include it in the bargaining agreement, and so that it becomes unionized work that's part of ours. We have also started to do some work in Canada and the United States as a union, going after the delivery drivers for Amazon. And I know in the States, the Teamsters have been doing some of that work too. We had certified 3 groups that delivered packages for Amazon in Ontario. And of course, magically, as soon as that happened, Amazon didn't have any work for them anymore. So we're still going through a series of hearings at the Ontario Labour Relations Board about that. But we're trying to get into that workspace too, to recognize that increasingly work that traditionally was being done inside stores and physical locations is now being pushed out to other areas. How do we address that? We need to make sure that we go talk to those workers too, and that people recognize the work that they're doing. I'm not as familiar as Angelo is with the decree system in Quebec. I can tell you that when that sort of concept was coming up in Ontario, where we were looking at our first major change to Ontario labor law, UFCW as a union certainly took a strong stance on we need to reform our labor laws to make bargaining easier. And that was looking at a more broad-based card-based certification system. But we used to have a fairly generous one in Ontario, and it got shrunk considerably. And we also talked a lot about sectoral bargaining and all kinds of different mechanisms, looking at European models, looking at some other models to see if we could gain some interest on the part of the politicians there. There was a thing that got done ahead of the Liberals changing the law called the Changing Workplaces Review. And there was a recommendation coming out of that, that some kind of broader sectoral bargaining system be looked at, whether it is a collective agreement that would apply in a city for one kind of workplace. So if you go organize people in a discount grocery retail, there's already a collective agreement that's there that they would just slide right into instead of bargaining a new separate agreement. And these are things as a union we believe we need to look at, that there needs to be some improvement for sure in the legislative models in order to functionally let people unionize. Because right now, the way the systems are, it really disadvantages people. It's very difficult for them to actually come in and get into a collective agreement. So we're looking at that. Similarly, California AB5 laws, I'm not that familiar with, but like Angelo was saying, I think as a union, we'd have some concern with some kind of mid-ground status. We have been doing a lot of work in Canada also around Uber, where we have taken a big approach of trying to get Uber recognized as employees and ultimately then members of the union. We've been doing that in Toronto, where we have a certification before the Ontario Labour Relations Board for the Uber Black drivers at the Pearson International Airport. And we've done a considerable amount of work in Vancouver and British Columbia for that as well. And so from our perspective, we think that, all of this temp agency use and this gig work is really just ways for people to skirt the laws and to avoid their obligations as employers to employees, and it devalues employment in a big way. And our preference would be to make sure that people are recognized as employees, that they have the same basis in law as all other employees, and then we can build it up from there. So that's where we would go. Consumer cooperatives is something that got brought up, and we see a bit of that sort of cooperative model more in Western Canada. And, Angelo, I know he has to go, but they've recently dealt with the co-op out there, where that was sort of built to be that kind of very, consumer and employer cooperative model that was supposed to be more generous. And what we have seen over time is it's morphed into more or less a traditional employer. Our local in Saskatchewan, who has co-op grocery stores, had a similar problem where we had a fairly lengthy strike with that group. So unfortunately, what we have seen with that specific case and in other cases is it's really turned into a traditional employer model with those kinds of things where profit seems to be the governing model. And so I think there has been some attention paid on, well, who sits on those boards? How do you have control of those things? Maybe we just can't take it for granted that the way these things were built will last forever, and that we need to reinvest in taking a look at those models too and making sure that we're involved in them so that they don't skirt and go into a negative viewpoint. In terms of coordination, I mean, we're big believers in coordination. In Canada, we have the Canadian Labour Congress and we have provincial federations of labor too that we're a part of. We always like to work with our affiliated partners at these things, and that has had varying degrees of success both in Canada and the United States. Even where we don't necessarily see people as affiliated members, like currently Unifor is not affiliated with the Canadian Labour Congress, there's still an incentive on all of our parts as entities who are here to improve workers' lives to talk to each other and look at what is going to work best. And so I think we're definitely intent on doing that. Part of what we need to do to get there is, I'll take you all the way back to my initial comments, is we really need to build up the concept of the value of these jobs both in the minds of the public and in the employees themselves, if we're really going to take those models. Because even if we trigger a legal strike, there are multiple collective agreements, and there are a lot of non-union retailers in Canada. In fact, now the majority of grocery retail, for instance, is non-union. And so if we close down a unionized metro, and all of them in the province or the country, there's still Loblaws, there's still Sobeys, there's still Walmart, etc. And so you have to build to the more mass model on that, and that's going to take some work if you're really going to trigger, say, a general strike. If you ask me today, would that be effective? I would tell you no. That doesn't mean it couldn't be in the future, but we've got to build toward that, and that's some work that's got to be done. Basic income and these things. I mean, our national office union spent a lot of time through this COVID-19 talking with the federal government about the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and trying to push on them to make changes to provide that. We started seeing people say, quite rightly, I can make more money on the CERB than I can working. And so we tried to address that and push for changes there, which slowly we started to see happen as the weeks went on, where people could start making some money and apply to it. If the future of work is going to be more decentralized and more technologically based, I think we're going to have to get creative with what we look at and what models we look at. So whether that's a universal basic income or if it is just providing a floor, I think there's definitely a role for government in there to regulate in order to ensure that the population has some supports and that work is meaningful. I think not unlike Angelo was saying, our preference at UFCW in terms of raising the floor has been to look at living wage and minimum wage increases to try to provide that, that base level to go there. But that doesn't mean that we're not prepared to look at all kinds of different options, whether it's UBI or if it's a automation tax on employers or these sorts of things. We're certainly interested in looking at it. The rating system, again, we haven't had much of that. As I said, we're starting to get into things like representing workers who deliver for Amazon and other companies, where they do get all of their work through a device that they hold in their hand, and the consumer can have some impact on them if there's a complaint. One of the things we heard from the Amazon delivery drivers is their employer's automatic response was to terminate their employment. And there was no appeal system to go there. And so certainly if they were unionized, then they have access to just cause discipline, and this would be a benefit. That's part of the reason they're coming to us and why we're going to continue to work on those areas of the new economy that are more gig-based and these kinds of things. But generally, our response to those kinds of rating things would be that if employers are using them for the purpose of reviewing work and doing discipline, we would be generally opposed to that kind of model. And I think I caught most of the questions, so I'll stop there.
Okay, so let's go straight on to Peter. If you could answer what you think needs to be answered in 5 minutes.
Sure, I'll do my best. Great questions, folks, and great panel altogether. So I would just respond to, I think one of the most important questions that was raised was Allison and Ushan's questions about race and gender inequalities within the workforce, who gets the job in the first place, who gets rehired, and how we combat those things. And I think it's very pertinent, especially at the current time, from US context, but pretty much all the time. I've recently been, to get a little esoteric for a second, I've been recently convinced by some sort of political economy reading, mainly Howard Botwinick, but also building the ideas of Anwar Sheikh, that, counter to what we're often told about capitalism, that it's going to sort of equalize conditions among wage earners, that actually capitalist competition perennially reproduces inequality among wage earners through the mechanism of competition itself. And when it does that, it's essentially, firms are essentially looking for low wage categories of workers, and those are often readily offered up to them by pre-existing or parallel divisions in society, specifically race and gender, but not only, right? Sexuality, nationality, age, and a whole host of other insidious divisions. So I think there's sort of two ways to most effectively challenge these things. Number one is what I think we're all on the same page with, is organizing as robustly as possible to take wages out of competition, either in regions or in whole countries or internationally, right? So that this doesn't become such a sort of invidious, vector of division that can be used by, firms in the formal economy. So there's that element to it. I also think beyond the sort of formal unionization, taking wages out of competition process, the point about universal basic income or other universal policies that could be fought for and won that raise the floor for all workers or non-workers, right? That make people less vulnerable to having to take whatever job comes along because they have to pay the rent, they have to afford food. I think that also will indirectly, in a sort of economistic way, help combat those divisions. But I don't think those in and of themselves will be enough, right? I'm not an economic reductionist. I don't think just by doing good union work and good sort of economic policy fighting that we're going to solve race and gender divisions. I think we definitely need explicit movements that use disruptive tactics, like what we're seeing right now in the U.S. to combat, entrenched racial and gender divisions. So we're going to need parallel movements in the economy, in the polity, and also in the broader society to help address those problems. Easier said than done, but I think we can see examples of where this is heading. I feel like I was able to some extent respond to at least a pair of questions there, or three. I'll just briefly touch on the I don't know if I don't know if it's Jonathan Peters raised a question about strikes, or Jay Peters raised a question about strikes and where those fit in, and I think that's very relevant. The work of Joe Burns, who's been raising that topic a lot in the U.S. recently, that basically the labor movement needs to revisit strikes, right, and revisit the topic of strikes or the threat thereof as a way to actualize worker power. So we can, throw fancy terms around all day: marketplace, structural power, blah 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 blah. But it doesn't really mean anything, and none of it's actualized until there's really a withdrawal of labor or the credible threat thereof. Especially in the case of structural or disruptive power, right? That's the way to. You're not leveraging unless you're using that power collectively to shut production down, or slow it down, or threaten to slow it down. So, sure, yes, I'm definitely very much on the same page. Now, again, it's easier said than done, right? Our practitioners on the panel will say, okay, it's one thing to talk, a whole lot about strikes, but to actually organize one effectively and successfully is a whole other matter. So I'm in no way trying to sort of gloss over all the long-term solidarity work and planning that needs to go into those. I'm unfamiliar with the specific food chain workers organizing campaign or organization that someone raised in the chat. But I do want to return to a point. I think this is relevant to a point that Chris raised earlier. How we view retail sector workers, right? If we're seeing a sort of transformation of many storefront jobs into warehousing jobs, right? It's often painted in the literature as a sort of a disappearing of retail jobs. Well, they're not disappearing. Actually, it's a bit debated, but it depends how you sort of slice and dice the numbers. Some folks would say that we're not even seeing an overall reduction in jobs related to selling. They're just changing form, and they're leaving the formal retail sector as it's codified by North American industry classification system, et cetera. But if we reconceptualize many warehousing, logistics, and delivery jobs as themselves actually being part of the broader retail sector, and then the task is, of course, finding unions or building unions and expanding the existing ones that can match those emerging industrial structures, right? So in the U.S., as Tim sort of pointed out, there's been this sort of jurisdictional division between UFCW and its predecessors and the Teamsters, or longshore unions, that have been the sort of more logistics side of things. So historically, retail workers' strikes and mobilization in the mid-20th century had a lot to do with, their success had a lot to do with whether or not they got solidarity from the Teamsters and cooperation. So those are intra-organizational political questions, but I think the more that those sectors and the workers in them can be combined and brought into the same fold of organizing and pressure building, I think that will help advance conditions in the retail sector.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. And now we'll proceed with Chris.
Okay, we're already over the agreed upon time. I'll try to make this brief. So in terms of race and gender, one thing to keep an eye on is, in fact, this shift from store-based work, and particularly from cashiers and salespeople to warehouse and delivery. And so that has sort of two different sets of effects. For women of color and white women, there's going to be more job losses. For men, and particularly men of color, it's going to be a question of job quality, because the job quality in warehouse and delivery is being rapidly degraded. And so I think that shift is important to keep in mind as we think about that. The question of strikes, I mean, I do know the Food Chain Workers Alliance. The main thing it does is sort of build consciousness of food workers as somehow linked. There's not a lot of sophisticated, supply chain leverage strategy. It's mainly just sort of building a public conception. But I think that's important because I think that, there's not, as Tim was saying, I don't think there's a lot of space right now for Jane McAlevey type of strikes in retail. But what I think there is space for and is happening is Fight for 15 type minority strikes that are not targeted at employers, but at the state, and that have actually compelled local and state governments in the United States to increase minimum wages. So they've actually, these strikes have succeeded without necessarily having that kind of density. And I think the state is going to be the key target of strikes in this sector for the foreseeable future. Angelo's gone, but I just wanted to give a shout out to the idea that maybe there should be retail as a public utility as one element of the sector. And I think the examples of Mexico and India are worth looking at. The one in Mexico's system has largely been dismantled, but actually worked pretty well while it was in place. Ujnish Singh Gupta asked a question in the chat that I just wanted about using blockchain to basically make working conditions at every point in the labor process visible to everybody, including consumers involved in the supply chain. The one thing I would say is the lessons from anti-sweatshop and fair trade organizing is you need to actually fight to make those conditions visible and fight to make sure that the standards you're applying are actually strong standards as opposed to sort of, worker rights light. Finally, I think it was Allison who said, well, what about universal basic income? It's like, we're actually leaving most of the biggest questions about labor on the table here. I mean, given the continuing advances in technology, the growing inequalities, we need to be talking about separating income from work. And also, given the sort of global sustainability crisis, we need to be talking about just producing and selling less stuff. So it's not about, let's have more retail jobs. It's like, well, ultimately, as a world, we have to have less of all this stuff, and we have to have income being distributed by other channels. That's a whole other discussion and maybe even a whole other conference, but I didn't want to leave it off the table.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I had questions of my own. I will not ask them. I initially had several questions because I've been working on retail for about 6-7 years now, but I'll just ask them the next time I chat with the panelists individually. But I wanted to thank them for this immensely rich panel. I thought it was great. And I know it's a sacrifice to come out on a Saturday. You all have families, personal lives. So thank you to all the participants as well who asked questions and who are engaged with it. I think this helped make the dynamic more fruitful. So I know we're already 20 minutes past time, so I won't say much more, but thanks to all. And I hope you guys have a nice weekend. I don't know, but and keep in the know of the UFCW, Unifor are continuing to have struggles. Follow their websites. Peter and Chris are continuing to do research on retail, so continue following their work. This conversation isn't over just because this panel is over. So have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Talk to you later.
Just end it.